North Carolina in Charlotte, and I do chair the Education and Labor Subcommittee on Workforce Protections. I've been on the Education Committee ever since I got here. This is my third term. I am an educator by training. I taught for 40 years in Greensboro, North Carolina at Bennett College for Women. And as the chair of the committee, I do take with the utmost seriousness the safety of our workers, no matter their occupation, no matter their station in life. And from our healthcare workers who provide lifelong service despite inadequate pay, long hours and the threat of violence, to our minors who face the threat of long-term health problems due to the danger of their work environment. All workers deserve a safe workplace. And how can anyone disagree with that? Unfortunately, it seems like every day we have to respond to some effort by the administration to weaken health and safety standards in our workplace. And that is absolutely unacceptable. Earlier this year, we saw the Department of Labor roll back workplace injury reporting, a simple requirement that large employers file a detailed list of workplace injuries was weakened under the guise of protecting worker privacy. There's no rational argument that this rule isn't needed. The Department of Labor's own Office of Inspector General reported that employers are not reporting hospitalizations or amputations or even the loss of an eye in a workplace. Public reporting of workplace injuries helps states enforce our labor laws, forces employers to remove potential hazards, and empowers our workers to demand improvements in their work environments. But put simply, you don't know what you don't know, but when you don't know that you don't know it, that becomes a problem. You know, there's no way we can prevent workplace injuries without knowing that the injuries are occurring. And if you you can't prevent these injuries with an OSHA that's continuously getting in the way and putting things on the chopping block. And many of you know that statistics that came from GAO about how long it takes OSHA to promulgate a new rule, 7 years. 7 years if you're lucky. Well, we've seen rules come out of OSHA take up to 20 years. No one can say that this isn't a direct result of deliberate policy choices by this administration that hamstring OSHA from hiring inspectors and performing their crucial service. Under this administration, we've seen nearly 5% of OSHA's federal inspection force leave and not be replaced. OSHA has made it clear that they need more manpower to do their job. The lack of inspectors makes it difficult to hold employers to account, making it more likely that there are settlements with reduced fines for safety violations, showing unscrupulous employers that the government will not hold them to account, and endangering the lives of workers nationwide. Well, today it is a new day, and because of partners like Representative Wild, the Ed and Labor Committee will now pursue an agenda that prevents violence against our healthcare and domestic workers, that increases penalties and fines on shady employers. That want to just congratulate this distinguished panel. I have a plane I'm going to have to catch right after votes. But thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. Thank you for all of your work in this area.
Thank you, Representative Adams, for your leadership and your comments. Before I start, I just wanted to announce to everybody that we are going to be streaming this live from our official Facebook page. I've been asked to make that announcement for those of you who care. I also want to thank especially the fine organizations who are represented here today: the National Employment Project, Public Citizen, the AFL-CIO, and AFSCME, represented here by Jim Irwin, who is a personal friend, longtime colleague, and hails from my district where he is president of the Labor Council. So Jim, thank you so much for joining us today. These organizations have been on the front line of fighting for worker protections and came at our call when we invited them to participate in this briefing. And I want to thank Jordan Barab, a senior policy advisor with the Education and Labor Committee, former Deputy Assistant Secretary at OSHA during the Obama administration, and someone who has worked to advance workers' health and safety his entire career. Thank you, Jordan, for moderating this discussion today. We're here today because of our shared concern over issues that will directly or indirectly affect virtually every person in this country: the rights, health, and safety of America's workers. The issues we're discussing, making sure that federal agencies are tasked with protecting workers and that they're getting the funding they need to be effective, expanding workplace reporting, ensuring that all workers are treated fairly and that fewer workers are getting injured on the job. These issues should be national priorities. They should be included in the metrics that we use to measure our economy, and they should be at the top of the agenda here in Washington. They should dominate headlines in the media. And by the way, this should be a bipartisan priority. Every single day, my constituents go to work and face the same challenges regardless of their political views. And it was a Republican president, Richard Nixon, who signed the Occupational Health and Safety Act into law and created OSHA and the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, NIOSH, in 1970. Today, the main challenge we face is not just a lack of progress, it's major policy changes that are actively undermining and endangering workers. We have seen the decision by the Department of Labor to reverse the improved tracking of workplace injuries and illnesses rule, which required companies with at least 250 employees to submit detailed reports on the safety level of their workplaces. Crucial information, not just for workers, but also for researchers who are trying to improve safety conditions across workplaces. In response to this alarming policy change, I led my colleagues in a letter to the Department of Labor, and Congressman Levin has introduced a resolution that would reinstate the original rule. Under this administration, OSHA has fewer safety inspectors on staff and has been carrying out far fewer inspections. This lack of enforcement is dangerous. It's signaling to employers across the country that they will not be held accountable. Just this week, I read an alarming report about how Amazon treats its workers in its warehouses when they get injured on the job. If this is the way that one of our largest employers in the nation treats its workers, what about workers in smaller, less visible companies? Ultimately, if we want to look our constituents in the eye and say with any degree of sincerity that we are looking out for them and for their families, we have an obligation to make sure that the relevant agencies have the staffing, funding, and support they need. And that's why during this past appropriations season, many of my colleagues and I prioritized robust funding in our appropriations request for OSHA and the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. This is about people's lives. It's about children from working families who may lose a parent depending on whether or not we have an effective policy in place. It's about 5,147 workers who died on the job in 2017, including a record rate of deaths from falls and from confined spaces. And it's about the more than 12,000 workers who suffer serious injuries on the job every day. Behind these unacceptable numbers are sons and daughters, sisters and brothers, fathers and mothers, husbands and wives. As a country, we can and we must do much better. And with that, I want to hand it over to Jordan so that we can have a conversation today about the challenges we face and how we can ultimately move closer to a future in which we protect all workers. Thank you. Thank you, Jordan.
All right, well, thank you. Pretty much my two first decades of my career at AFSCME. Next to him is Peg Seminario, who is the Director of Safety and Health at the American Federation of Labor, Congress of Industrial Organizations, and has been with the AFL-CIO since the mid-1970s. And then there's Debbie Berkowitz, who was also with us at OSHA as Chief of Staff and Chief Labor Policy Advisor, and is now with the National Employment Labor Project. And finally is Shanna Devine, with Public Citizen, who I've also worked with quite a bit. In fact, working with Public Citizen, I think, since my very first day at AFSCME in 1982. So you have basically the all-stars of health and safety here in Washington. You can't get much better than this panel. So let's get started, and let's start on my immediately left with David. We're dealing here with essentially a matter of life and death, and to get a general idea of the scope of what we're talking about, what this agency and what American workers are dealing with here in the 21st century, I'll start off with David.
Thank you, Jordan. First, let me also thank Mrs. Weld for calling this briefing together, and also to comment that I don't get a chance to say this often, but the Education and Labor Committee has, as a staff person, one of the most knowledgeable people in the country on safety and health, and that's really a great resource. I think that having also worked at that committee at one point, it's rare to have that sort of resource, so we're very fortunate that Jordan's there. Mrs. Weld gave you some of the statistics, but let me put them in some context to see what the challenge is. Every day in the American workforce, 14 workers are killed essentially in trauma. We're not talking about illnesses at all or chronic injuries, but people killed sort of more or less on the spot. There's a lot of discussion about these Boeing 737 MAXs and going down, and two of them have gone down. But 14 workers a day is the equivalent of 3 of those every month. It goes on and on and on. And there are no congressional hearings on that, or there haven't been for the last several years, and there isn't the same sort of focus. It's acceptable for workers to die like that. I mean, that's what you have to assume. You have to conclude that we don't really care that much, because that's how many workers are killed every day on the job, 14 every day. In terms of injuries, we have a number, which is, depending on how you look at 3 or 4 million a year, but that we know how inaccurate that is. That's based on samples of employers keeping track of their own injuries, and it's notoriously incomplete. That's particularly incomplete for some industries like farm workers, for example, where employers just don't record the injury. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics that actually provides that estimate has acknowledged, after doing a lot of research, that's probably between a 30 and 60% undercount. So we could be talking easily about 5 million workers injured on the job, serious injuries on the job every year. Very high number, again, one that's sort of ignored, it's accepted. That's occupational hazard, it comes with a job, it's not acceptable. And we know even less about workplace illnesses. We know from studies done by epidemiologists with the National Cancer Institute, with NIOSH, that exposures in the past to chemicals that OSHA has to some extent controlled, asbestos, benzene, and now recently we issued a silica standard a few years ago when we were at OSHA. Those exposures cause 50,000 deaths a year. But there is no research going on now about what the current exposures are, and OSHA really is not able to do a good job controlling those standards. So those are the 3 big challenges, I think.
All right, thank you, David. So it's been almost 50 years since the Occupational Safety and Health Act was passed, and it was really a revolutionary law that for the first time gave workers a legal right to a safe workplace. In those 50 years, not only have the challenges and budget, resource challenges, legal challenges to OSHA increased, but we live today in a very different economy than we lived in 1970. So to talk about some of the challenges that we're facing today, and especially that the Occupational Safety and Health Administration is facing and that workers are facing because of that, I'll turn it over to Peg Seminario.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jordan. And again, thanks Representative Weld for pulling this together. It's been a long time since we've had a OSHA briefing here on the Hill, so thank you very much. So just a little bit of context here about OSHA as the federal agency of the Department of Labor responsible for safety and health. It's a federal law passed nearly 50 years ago, and it's been tweaked a couple of times, but it is today what it was then. And it was great in 1970, but like a lot of things from 1970, it could use some improvement. So we've got some problems with the law, but basically it's a pretty good, pretty sound statute for the people that it covers. But there are a lot of workers that aren't covered. OSHA is a law that federalized safety and health, but it gave states the opportunity to opt in if they ran their own plan that was as good as the federal government. So in 21 states, you have the states operating the OSHA plan. But the only way that state and local public employees get covered is if there's a state plan. And so, those 21 states and 5 others have said, we're gonna cover public employees. But in half the states, state and local public employees are not covered by OSHA. Another group that really has almost no protection under the Occupational Safety and Health Act is farm workers. They fall through the cracks under a lot of labor laws, and because of the nature of the exposures, some of it's covered by EPA, because of riders that have been in the appropriations bills since 1977, OSHA has no authority on small farms, yet agriculture has got some of the highest fatality rates in the country. So this is an agency, broad responsibilities, we have 145 million workers, we've got 10 million establishments, and OSHA last year, FedOSHA had 752 inspectors. So when you look at what's happened over time, population has grown, problems have gotten more complicated. OSHA today is its high point was 1980 last year, the Carter administration. And so the agency has not been able to keep up with even the basic problems. 2016, a standard on silica, it took that long. 20 years of a rulemaking and 40 years since OSHA started looking at it. So the kind of problems that keep emerging, the agency isn't dealing with. A big one right now is workplace violence, as we heard from Jordan and Representative Adams. Big problem, particularly in healthcare, social services, huge problem for women workers, and we're trying to get a workplace violence standard, which the Obama administration started. This administration has shut it down, so we're coming back to with the law. You've got lots of problems amongst the temp workers. You've got problems with all the joint employment arrangements in the in the economy, and so what you have here is an agency that tries hard, but isn't able to do the job, and an administration on top of that really is minimizing the level of effort in this area. So you've got an erosion of inspectors. Enforcement is, it hasn't been slashed like it has at EPA, but it certainly isn't stepping up to what needs to be done. And on the regulatory front, you heard about the various cutbacks. There are more that I could go through, but nothing is happening. Nothing is happening, no progress. And so I think where we are today is really no progress in improving safety and health in the workplace, an erosion over time, and no commitment from the top, which means more workers at risk, major problems not being dealt with, and for the folks here on the Hill, a lot of work to do to make sure that workers in this country are protected. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Peg. So as Peg mentioned, and I think it's obvious to everyone here, this administration has not exactly been friendly to workers or friendly to workplace safety. They've been hostile to regulations. You never hear the word regulation without the words job killing in front of it. And really, what are regulations but really worker protections or environmental protections? They've been hostile to enforcement of those regulations and those standards as well. So to go into a little bit more about what we're talking about, I'll turn it to Debbie Berkowitz, who over at NELP, which is the National Employment Law Project, not Labor Project, who's been doing some amazing work in terms of digging out exactly what the Trump administration has been doing and unfortunately has not been doing. So Debbie?
Thanks, Jordan, and thanks, Representative Wild. Really, there's been like no oversight of OSHA for 2 years, and I think this is the first, House briefing on OSHA, so thank you. And we did a paper on this. I have some copies here, and there's some copies in the back I can give people. But, enforcement is really the heart and soul of the agency. Enforcing standards to protect workers, and it saves lives, and it saves money. I mean, OSHA ensures that employers provide safe conditions. It ensures that employers that may think about cutting corners on safety, that they don't. And in the end, not only does it save lives and limbs, but it saves money for employers. So the operative word here is safety pays, that OSHA regulations, David Michaels coined this when we were at OSHA together, that OSHA regulations don't kill jobs, they prevent jobs from killing workers. And there have been studies by Harvard and Berkeley business schools that when OSHA goes in and does an inspection, serious injuries go down. The company saves lots of money, just to show you that providing safe conditions pays. One thing for those of you new to OSHA that I want to tell you is OSHA is not like your county health department where they inspect every workplace, once a year, every restaurant. I mean, the AFL-CIO has done a lot of estimates, and the estimate is it would take OSHA 150 years to inspect every workplace under its jurisdiction just once. It's worse now. Okay, the new numbers are coming out. Well, that's because you'll see. And the other thing for you to know, at least when we were at OSHA, OSHA was 1/9 the budget of EPA. So it's just an underfunded agency really from the beginning. It's just been very controversial. And the last thing I want to tell you, for those of you that may be lawyers, is there is no work or private right of action when it comes to safety. You can sue your boss if you're a worker for not providing safe conditions. All you have is OSHA, that's it. So under some wage laws, you can sue in court if your employer steals your wages, but you cannot do anything when it comes. So OSHA is it for safety. And I took a look at the first 2 years of the Trump administration, and yesterday Secretary Acosta testified and was quite slippery with his numbers. But just overall, the first 2 years of the Trump administration versus the last 2 years of Obama administration have seen an overall decline of 3,000 inspections a year, which is a lot when you're not doing a whole lot of inspections to begin with. But in 2016, OSHA, under David Michaels and Jordan, actually changed the way they conducted inspections, and not conducted inspections, the way they counted inspections. This is a little complicated, but instead of measuring enforcement by how many inspections, were done by the agency, every inspection said it was given a weighted number, and they were given an enforcement unit. So inspections that took 6 months, which is the maximum time you can take to do an inspection under OSHA, got more credit than an inspection that took an hour. And this was to incentivize OSHA staff for taking longer on inspections, like doing measurements in the workplace that may add another month onto your inspection calendar. I mean, you could do some other quick inspections, to do inspections on heat or workplace violence or explosions. And if you look at OSHA now in terms of enforcement units and the weighted system that they now measure every inspector's productivity by, under Trump, the number of enforcement units is also down from 2016, 1,000 a year. So you can see that inspections are declining. And when you really look at the data, you see that what they're doing is a lot of short, quick, non-impactful inspections where they run onto a construction site, let's say, for example, and there are 7 subs, and they quickly go through there and they have 7 inspections in about, an hour, and so, and they probably didn't find any violations, and then they go on. Like 30% of OSHA inspections, or 28% don't find violations. So if you look, they're down 1/2 the number of heat-related inspections, though it's one of the hottest years on record. 1/3 the number of inspections dealing with preventing musculoskeletal disorders like carpal tunnel syndrome and tendonitis, which are prevalent of a lot of industries, especially low-wage industries like meat and poultry processing. And they have reduced the number of inspections by 1/3 involving measuring chemical exposures to workers in the workplace. And the other thing is they have about 1/2 the number of what we call significant cases, which are cases that are so serious, that have taken so long, and the violations are so great that they actually go to the front office for review. There are 1/2 of those now. And the other thing I wanted to tell you about is they've also issued only 1/3 the number of press releases. And why is that important on their enforcement cases? Because OSHA can't be everywhere. Publicizing enforcement cases is important because it acts as a deterrent to other employers that may be thinking of cutting corners. But when they hear about an inspection, it's actually been proven, there's been a study done, that it actually leads them to correct a hazard. So not only are they reducing enforcement, that they're sort of disappearing from the workplace there.
Okay, thank you, Debbie. All right, so we know, kind of gotten a general outline about what's going on here in Washington or in the nation and with OSHA. Let's talk a little bit about how this affects people on the ground. And I want to turn for that over to Jim Irwin, who is on the ground and actually represents people who are affected by all of these issues that we're talking about today. Jim?
Thank you, Jordan. Thank you, Representative Wild. One of the things I wanted to talk about is the rollback on the online reporting. The reportables, the EMR. EMR is the earned modification rate, and it's basically how an employer or a contractor gets billed on their insurance. So if they have a higher EMR, their insurance rates go down. The EMR is based off of the online reporting. So it is a paper trail. Employers have claimed that this is cumbersome for them to report online, but what it really comes down to is real-time data that OSHA can track instead of pretty much playing a cat and mouse game with the employer to try to find out what injuries have actually happened on the job site. With no requirement of online reporting and a logical way to track it, considering there are 130 million workers in America, OSHA cannot process all this data by with a hand and paper. So eliminating that online recording has become a problem, especially with construction and building trades, especially in the Lehigh Valley.
Let me prompt you a little bit, Jim, too, because Jim's also has the privilege of being a public employee in Pennsylvania, which is one of the 24 states in this country where public employees actually have no coverage by OSHA. They have no right to a safe workplace. And Jim, do you want to say a few words about that?
Well, yeah, so public sector employees in Pennsylvania are not covered by OSHA. I mean, they're supposed to follow OSHA standards. However, if you have an issue, you work in an older school or a nursing home or any public building that has asbestos or anything like that where you come in contact with it, you cannot call OSHA. They can't come in and test that. Correction officers or highway workers are not held to the same standard as private contractors that are on public jobs have OSHA, and our PennDOT workers are not covered, by OSHA. They don't follow the same standard. I don't know if you want me to.
No, that's great.
One
yeah,
point that I think is really important to make is that when you look at the injury data, what you see in the public sector is that public sector workers have much higher injury rates, and it's not just by state and local. You compare healthcare in the public sector, state and local, to private, and what you have is a much higher rate, because those are some of the most difficult, dangerous jobs, and those workers don't have protection. And so it's a real impact for those workers not having protection. They might have something on paper, but there's nothing to back it up. There's no capacity, there's no enforcement, and as a result, workers are paying the price.
So you have a crazy patchwork in this country where you have workers in states like North Carolina, which Mrs. Adams represents, who are protected if they go down into a deep trench. You can, OSHA can come in sight and hopefully prevent that type of thing, whereas...
State OSHA, yeah.
State OSHA, yeah, they have a state OSHA. There are 21 states that run their full state OSHA plans and another 5 states that have public employees plans. Whereas, the same worker doing the exact same job in Pennsylvania, where Mrs. Wild is from, have no protections at all. And again, this is now almost 50 years after the Occupational Safety and Health Act was passed. There's a fact sheet outside on the Protecting America's Workers Act, which we'll talk about more, but the Protecting America's Workers Act is something that it's kind of a collection of a number of extremely important improvements for the Occupational and Safety and Health Act, one of which would provide coverage to all public employees in the country. So get a hold of that and read it, and if your boss hasn't co-sponsored it yet, feel free to do that. Let me turn our last panelist to Shannon Devine from Public Citizen, and we'll talk about some of the challenges we're facing and some of the things we're really doing about them, some of the initiatives we're going to be taking on those. And I wanted to say, Public Citizen, when we were all at OSHA, Public Citizen was one of our biggest supporters and also our fiercest critics, but critics in a good way, really trying to push us to do more of what we wanted to do anyway. So, Shannon?
Thank you, Jordan. It's a privilege to be a part of this esteemed panel, and thank you so much, Representative Wild, for your leadership in this space. So I'm going to shift gears and say it is not all gloomy. It is a new day, as Representative Adams acknowledged, and I'll flag why. We're very excited to be working with this committee in particular, the Education and Labor Committee, And I'm gonna talk about a few areas where we're looking to proactive OSHA measures. And really the point of my few minutes here, and I'll try to keep it brief and read to do so, but it's to say that OSHA needs to be shifting its limited resources and energy to advancing workplace protections rather than rolling them back in the ways that this panel has identified. So I'm gonna highlight a few ways in which it can. The first area I'll highlight is OSHA's current efforts, or excuse me, this is actually the Department of Labor's current efforts to roll back protections for minors who work in the healthcare industry, specifically teenagers who are lifting and moving patients. Some may be familiar with this effort. Debbie has reported on it quite a bit, and others. Really what OSHA needs to be doing is focusing on expanding protections for all workers in the healthcare industry to ensure that there's a safe patient handling standard. Some may be aware, but musculoskeletal disorders, which often occur when a nurse or healthcare practitioner is moving or lifting a patient, is the leading cause of injuries for nursing assistants, and there are no OSHA standards in this space. Previously, Congress has worked to introduce legislation, and we very much hope it will do so again this Congress. And it's one example where it should be shifting its resources to actually protect workers and not roll back rights. I'm going to move into a few other examples where Congress is taking action at this time. As Peg mentioned, there's the Workplace Violence Prevention Bill. That's HR 7141, and it's led by Representative Joe Courtney.
1309.
Excuse me, I'm sorry, I pulled up the number from last year. 1309, HR 1309, read by Representative Courtney. Thank you. And it's being championed by the panelists here today. We absolutely support this legislation. The goal, in short, is to ensure that workers in the healthcare and social service industry are able to respond effectively to a workplace violence incident by having preventative measures in place. It's a very common sense legislation, as representatives have identified here today, and it needs to advance. This is especially urgent because, as Peg touched on, workplace violence incidents in the healthcare industry are going up. Government research has found this, and in fact, if you're in the healthcare industry, you are 12 times as likely to be impacted by a workplace violence incident than within the rest of the workforce. So this is incredibly significant and time sensitive. Shifting gears to another very time sensitive issue is the problem of heat in the workplace, which was also touched on today, and we're thrilled that this committee is going to be looking at this issue. So to give you a bit of background, just 18 of the last 19 years have been the hottest on record. This is a direct result of climate change, and this problem is only going to intensify in the coming years. I'm just going to give a few stats that underscore why this is important, not only for worker protection, but worker productivity and businesses being able to profit at the end of the day. So it's expected that by the end of this century, up to 40% of daylight hours will be unworkable due to heat. And the global projections are that this could cost globally the GDP about 20%. So this is obviously a significant economic as well as workplace safety matter that we want to address. Fortunately, the solutions to climate change in this situation to protecting workers are somewhat direct. So not only do we, when we think about climate change, need to think about how to lower greenhouse gas emissions and other areas of concern, we also need to think about how to protect the workers directly impacted by climate change. In this respect, workers need access to water, shade, breaks, and some other pretty significant measures. But that's, those are the most concrete examples, and this is absolutely doable. We've seen in several states, California, where Representative Chu led legislation when she was at the General Assembly, they've enacted an OSHA heat standard at the state level, as have Washington and Minnesota. The U.S. military has heat protections in place. This is common sense. We need to have them in place to protect our service members. And we've seen some voluntary programs as well that I won't go into now because of time. But the point is, when these programs are put in place, it works. It saves money, as Debbie had identified. Safety pays. And it also protects workers, most importantly. So this is an issue that we are very proud to be working on. There's a broad coalition of labor groups. United Farm Worker Justice are some of our lead partners on this. But we're also working with environmental groups. So we're working with public health experts, Dr. David Michaels, who was active in the launch of this campaign, and most groups on this panel are saying we need to enact heat protections, and we're doing so in partnership with the leadership of Education and Labor, Representative Chu, of course, and then leadership of the Health Committee on the Democratic side to work to advance these protections. And we very much hope that your offices will consider joining us as that legislation moves forward. I'll just close by saying all of these examples I've identified, OSHA has acknowledged they are dangers for workers in the workplace, and yet they have failed to enact standards at any level for these different issue areas. And that's why Congress is now acting and pushing their hand to do so. So we very much appreciate the leadership, and we look forward to working with you.
Thanks, Shannon. Debbie, do you have something to add?
I just wanted to, I looked down at my notes, sorry, thanks Jordan, and I realized there are two things I wanted to tell you that jumped out of me at the data when I looked at it, and this is really where you all and your bosses and Representative Weil come in, and that is OSHA's budget was not cut all that much over the last couple of years, and thanks to the Democrats in the House and the Senate, and the AFL-CIO and AFSCME and all they did. But staffing for inspectors is the lowest ever in the agency. And that's because they did not fill any vacancies during the whole fiscal year 2017. Then they put some more they put new procedures in place that made it a longer time and harder to hire people. So that they haven't, so their inspections on board as of January 2019 was the lowest it has ever been, lower than last year and way lower than it was during the last years of the Obama administration. And that when you also take a look at the data and where OSHA's been inspecting, the number of fatality inspections where a worker has died or there's a catastrophe and 3 or more workers are sent to the hospital, which is very rare, that is at the highest number in fiscal year 2018 that it's been in a decade. And that's something that we really need to pay attention to, that there are consequences when OSHA sort of disappears from the workplace. So that's what I wanted to say.
I just want to add one thing. Federal OSHA covers, again, pretty much 21 states and another 6 states where public employees are covered. The state plans then have their own OSHA inspectors. They receive about 50% of their funding from the federal government. But their budgets have also been essentially flat for years and years, which means their staffing levels are also going down. So we're seeing this not only on those of you who are from states with OSHA state plans, but also those of you that are covered by federal OSHA inspectors. Peg?
Just one point here as well, tied to enforcement, without getting into a lot of detail. Appointments of people to agencies matter, and where things are right now at OSHA, there still is no confirmed assistant secretary. He was nominated a couple of years ago. His name is Scott Mugno. He was the VP of safety for FedEx, and FedEx doesn't have they have a mixed safety and health record. Let's say that. But coming at it from, we've had some decent people at OSHA who have come out of the corporate side, but we've also had some people who have not been so good, and they obviously bring an orientation. One agency that's sort of a sleeper agency here that may have impacts on OSHA for years to come after this administration is the agency that deals with contested enforcement cases, the Occupational Safety and Health Review Commission. If you're an employer, you get cited, you can contest, and you go before this independent body. And that commission has had 2 Trump appointees, the chair by the name of Heather McDougal, Chairman Sullivan, also a Trump appointee, and then a Obama.
Scott's district, they've already said they don't need to use coal slag anymore. So that's really sort of this nasty regulatory rollback for the sake of an industry that doesn't really need protection at all and exposing workers. The other thing is because of the Trump victory, OSHA's final standard on beryllium in general industry, the major beryllium producer, Materion, has said, well, they don't really like exactly the same. They want a bunch of rollbacks as well. So everything is on hold, and really what was a standard that really was acceptable to most parties and should just move forward is now really up in the air.
All right, thank you. Let me move to kind of a different area. We've, in case anybody didn't notice, there's quite a bit of discussion in this country about immigrants and immigrant workers, and I was just, maybe Peg could talk a little bit about what the effect of that is on health and safety among immigrant workers.
Well, not surprising that when you look at who is at high risk of workplace injury and workplace death, that workers, Latino workers have a much higher rate of fatal injury, and amongst Latino workers, you look at foreign-born workers again, a much higher rate of workplace death. Due to a number of factors. I mean, one of the factors being that these workers work in some of the dirtiest jobs, but also that they don't have protection, and they are also largely unorganized, don't have the benefits of a union contract, and are at risk of, particularly now in this administration, of deportation if they raise any kinds of safety and health concerns. So when you look at what's happened over time, the fatality rates of Latino workers came down dramatically. So as there were more and more efforts and focus on that, they began to go back up, which again is not surprising at all. And so I think the concern with all these different vulnerable groups here, they are at high risk in so many different ways. They really do need extra levels of effort by the government to focus inspections, to focus assistance, outreach. And so those groups of workers can no longer look, confidently to the government for any assistance in these areas. And so the work that worker centers and others are doing on the ground with these workers is so critical to be their voice and to be their representative. And one of the things that OSHA did under the Obama administration, they gave unorganized workers the rights to have representatives in filing complaints and inspections, because those workers need those kind of protections. The Trump administration has rolled that back, essentially said, no, if you're unorganized, you can't be represented, you're on your own, so it's a real problem.
Can I just add to that? This affects all workers, not just Latino workers, immigrant workers, undocumented workers. If an underhanded employer knows that they can go to Home Depot and pick up some workers who are there in line and not give them any protections if they fall from a height, well, they're just gonna, they'll go back to Mexico, they're never gonna complain. Why should they hire any other worker? Why should they hire a union worker? Why should they hire a legal worker? It's really a disaster for all workers. Unless we raise the bar for all workers, every worker is at risk.
All right, thanks. So it's not just OSHA that's rolling back protections for workers. There are other agencies also that protect workers. One of the things the Trump administration has tried to do every budget year is get rid of the Chemical Safety Board, for example, which is an independent government agency that oversees and investigates, does very good root cause investigations of chemical plant accidents. Wage and Hour also has responsibility for miners, not the kinds that go underground, but the kinds that are young. And they've been rolling those back too, and if Debbie could very briefly talk a little bit about what's going on over there.
It's sort of unbelievable, and yesterday, actually Representative DeLauro kept asking Secretary Acosta, are you gonna withdraw this rule, because there's no evidence, but out of nowhere, they decided that in the guise of like saying we're gonna increase teen employment, we're gonna roll back child labor protections for young workers, 16 and 17 in nursing homes, hoping that then more get hired. There's absolutely no evidence that young workers are having any trouble getting hired in nursing homes at all. And the protection they want to roll back right now is that young workers often are asked to lift patients, and so the way to do it is to use these lifting devices that are big mechanical devices, but they're difficult, they can hurt patients if you don't use them right, and you can get hurt using them. And so the DOL policy that's been in effect since 2012, and there's never been anybody that at least came to us when we were at OSHA since 2012 that this was a problem, is that any worker who's 16, 17 has to work with another worker in using these lifts, and that worker has to be 18 or over, meaning that they probably have at least a year of experience doing this so that you have them being supervised. They want to roll that back and allow 16 and 17-year-olds to use those lifts by themselves, and patient advocates, child advocates, and there's absolutely no evidence that it's gonna increase employment in nursing homes, but what it will allow is nursing homes in different parts of the country to, just hire 16 and 17-year-olds and then get rid of them and hire new 16 and 17-year-olds, and that's not gonna be good for anybody in the country. I also wanna do a little pivot here and say today's Washington Post on the front page is a story about another government agency that does have an impact on worker safety, though under the Trump administration, they're now denying this. And that is the USDA has a rule that's supposed to be final in May, and we're hoping that doesn't happen because members in the Senate and the House just called for an OIG investigation, but this is a rule that would allow pork companies to take over food safety inspection, and because they have to hire some additional staff, the USDA is gonna allow them to run their line speeds in pork processing plants, hog slaughter plants, as fast as they can, and that will really increase worker injuries, and there is no doubt about that, and they don't really care. The USDA, Obama never would have let this kind of rule go out, and so I just wanna flag this for you, anybody on the Ag Committee, to let me know, okay.
One of the things all these rollbacks in OSHA, wage and hour, USDA, EPA, and everywhere else have in common is that the administration is trying to push these through with pretty much no evidence. And the evidence for no evidence is the fact that this administration have many times more of their regulatory initiatives or rollbacks have been overturned in the courts than any previous administration. I think the average is usually, 6 or something per year, and this administration is up to, 60 or 70 now. And it's, again, it's just evidence, again, of lack of evidence and lack of following procedures that are set by law. Let me give you one more chance for anybody to ask questions. Yes, and introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Tiffany Dollar. I work with the Pennsylvania branch of the NEA, so the teachers union. Used to work with AFSCME, used to work myself in healthcare when I was a teenager, so lots of this stuff is popping off in my mind, but what I'm most interested in is we've talked a lot about represented versus unrepresented workers, and obviously there's been a lot of attacks on the ability of workers to organize. So I know it's not necessarily the topic of this panel, we have somebody from the AFL here, so I wanted to just ask the question. I know I've seen bills introduced for like national right to work legislation, is there anything on the other end that we're doing?
Yes, that's a very good question. The reality is that with a union contract and with union representation, you've got more rights and you also have protection, and you've got somebody standing behind you and with you, and so it is a very different situation. And one of the things that's happened in the States with all these right to work rollbacks, right, for state and local public employees, they no longer even have collective bargaining rights, so they got no OSHA protection, they got no union contract, and when you look at the data, what you see is that in right to work states, you're more likely to be killed on the job, right? So, but yes, there are new proposals, legislative proposals that are being introduced, that are coming before the Education and Labor Committee to strengthen the labor laws to improve workers' right to organize, so that you're not, so that you have more protection if you're retaliated, if you're fired for exercising your rights, and in changing the labor laws. And I wouldn't say the labor laws, the worker right to organize laws, because this is about working people organized, is one of the top priorities that we have. It's not gonna become law in this Congress, but trying to lay the groundwork for that effort. And so you'll be seeing a lot of activity, and it'll be front and center coming up in the 2020 election cycle here about workers' rights, workers' protections, but particularly workers' rights to organize.
All right, thanks. We have another question. Rebecca,
Yeah.
yes.
Rebecca Rainer with Politico. I understand under the Obama administration, there was a memorandum of understanding between DHS and DOL regarding, so if DOL was already investigating a labor dispute in that workplace, DHS wouldn't go in for an enforcement action. So I'm curious, is there any evidence that this MOU is still in effect?
I can't answer that question. I haven't seen any, but
Debbie?
So one of the issues, Rebecca, is that the MOU covers like civil cases, And so, the problem now is when like ICE is raiding places, they're calling it criminal. And
Okay.
so the MOU technically it doesn't really cover that.
Yeah,
And-
Can we spend a minute though, explaining to everyone else what we're talking about?
Yeah, the MOU basically, if there was any kind of OSHA, I mean, basically it required DHS to check in with OSHA to see if there was any enforcement activity going on. And if there was, so that employers couldn't basically, essentially retaliate against workers by turning them into ICE. If there was any health and safety activity going on, then basically DHS agreed not to go in there to do any immigration activities.
Or to wait until the.
Or at least to wait until after the OSHA
And so,
investigations were over.
what happened, I think what Rebecca's talking about is a case in a Fresh Mark, I think there was a meatpacking plant in Ohio, northeastern Ohio, that was subject to a big OSHA investigation, and right at the end, right before the penalties came out, and there were very high penalties, ICE came in and arrested the workers, and
Right.
something, I felt like something went wrong there, but, if you look at the dotted line, ICE called that case, and they didn't, before that, it wouldn't have been, they called it a criminal investigation.
But the idea is this chills any worker participation or willingness to work with OSHA if you think your employer is gonna retaliate against you. And there have been too many cases of that, so we tried to focus on that, and we'll see if that
I mean, OSHA itself doesn't care if you're documented or not. OSHA is there to protect all workers. They don't turn anybody into ICE. They don't care if you're documented or not. But a lot of workers don't know that, so employers will often threaten workers and
You
call
said there's a
ICE.
subsidy coming back from federal government to states that provide OSHA for state workers. In 30 seconds or less, how does that work?
Yeah.
What-
The
what would
Occupational
you
Safety and
know?
Health Act gives states the opportunity to run their own state plans. If they do that, they have to cover public employees. It also gives states the opportunity to just cover their public employees, and the feds still cover the private sector. And the states that do that basically receive, well, according to the law, 50% of their funding from the federal government, which is not to say that the states say we need X amount of money and feds cough up 50%. It means that the feds look at their budget and decide how much they can spend on each state, and the states basically have to match that. But again, some states overmatch, but theoretically, each state has to get at least 50% of its funding from the federal government to run its state program. And again, there are 21 states that do private sector programs in public, and another 5 states that do public sector only programs.
But Jordan, if Pennsylvania wanted to do just a public employee program, because it has a very good federal program in there, does OSHA give them funding for that too?
Yeah, if they want, it has to be a federally approved program, and the feds require that the state plans be quote-unquote at least as effective as the federal program. So there are a number of criteria they have to meet in terms of enforcement, having enough resources, issuing standards that have to be the same as OSHA's or more effective. If they can meet all those standards and have the funding and resources to do that, then OSHA can approve them. And again, 5 states have done that just for public employees.
In Massachusetts, it's on its way too, so
Hopefully.
maybe some.
But even with the state workers, they only get half that funding then.
Right.
So-
Yeah, right. So it still costs the state something,
It
but.
still costs money, yeah.
Other questions? Yeah.
Hi, Vashon Kelly with APOP. We work specifically with farm workers, and so a lot of this is just me nodding my head, yes. But is there, and I probably know the answer to this, but how could we kind of like get DOL, specifically OSHA and EPA, to maybe come together and create some sort of MOU where the pressure is not necessarily on the worker to have to report an incident or a workplace safety issue for the reasons that we stated?
So you're talking about taking the onus off the workers to have to, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you want to talk, I mean, one of the things would be have a union, that would help.
Yes.
Well, as you've heard, I mean, one of the things that's tough is that, the resources that are, of the agency are so limited, that when they're out there affirmatively on their own, right, for OSHA, it's limited. I mean, they're also, they do a lot of fatality investigations, worker complaints, et cetera. So most of OSHA's activity is actually initiated by an event of something, either a worker complaint or a fatality, so just getting them, on their own. Work has been done over time trying to get the agencies to work together. One of the difficulties is in the ag space, obviously, that the agriculture industry doesn't want OSHA involved. I mean, the agency, EPA, could cede some authority, right, over the pesticides, they could do it. But they don't, and they don't because we know who controls the pesticide program. So any movement there is gonna be difficult, but I think one of the bigger problems, or even a bigger problem for agriculture workers, is this horrible prohibition that has been in the OSHA appropriations bill since 1977, which says that, small farms of 10 or fewer, that essentially, you don't get anything. It's not like you just can't enforce. You don't get the coverage of standards, you don't get training, you get nothing. And so I think trying to focus on that rider and opening things up somewhat. You've got situations where young workers being killed on farms here, OSHA can't even go in to find out what happened, let alone do anything about it. And so it's a really, really bad situation.
All right, one more, and then we're over time.
Virginia Reed with Farmer for Justice. Just to add to that, another complication is that agriculture workers are hampered in their ability to organize. And so, if we are seeing more action at the state levels, we would want to see agriculture included in the right for collective bargaining.
Okay, I think we're over time here. They haven't turned off the lights yet, but we probably need to wrap this up because I'm sure everybody has other things to do. Let me just conclude, first of all, by thanking very much our panelists for taking the time out of their busy days to come and help educate everybody on this. Second of all, I want to mention a couple of pieces of the legislation we mentioned. There's a workplace violence legislation that would protect healthcare workers and social service workers from violent incidents and assaults. That's HR 1309. The Protecting America's Workers Act, which we didn't talk about too much today, but nevertheless is an excellent piece of legislation that we will be dealing with in the committee. That's HR 1074. Brother back there mentioned Workers' Memorial Day. That's April 28th. There are events all over the country to, as they say, pray for the dead and fight like hell for the living. Encourage your members to get involved in those. Check in with the labor unions in your area. And finally, me. I'm, again, on the Education and Labor Committee. If anybody here has any questions about not just policy issues, but if you have any constituent issues dealing with workplace safety and health, please get in touch with me and we'll help you out there. So again, thank you all for coming and thank you for the panelists.
If anybody wants a copy of this, I'll put it up here, so if not, I'll take them back home.
Thank you all.